There are two types of lawyer who talk about GDPR, of which I'm pleased to say I'm neither. There's a sort of lawyer that stands up here and scares the pants out of you. So you give them a cheque for £250,000 to make you GDPR compliant. Well, there's lots of lawyers around here in the city that do that. There's two problems with that. One is, I already said, I'm not that sort of lawyer. And the second problem is that even if you did give me a cheque for £250,000, I wouldn't do the job anyway because I work for myself and I don't do jobs that big. But I know plenty of people who do jobs that big, and that's how much it will cost you to be GDPR compliant. But of course, I'm not even talking about GDPR compliance here. I'm talking about why you won't get fined with GDPR, which is a different thing entirely, just a small subsection of GDPR. The second sort of lawyer that likes GDPR is a sort of lawyer that likes bureaucracy, that likes rules, that likes to set and determine rules so you can follow these rules and you'll be okay. No imagination whatsoever. Those lawyers hate me because, of course, I put them out of a job by saying, don't worry about it. I'm going to give you this talk in one word. The rest is just detail. And the one word is statistics. You will see the statistics are you are not going to get fined, or at least you'll be pretty unlucky to get fined. And if we've got time, we might look at sort of people that might get fined, but that's a different question entirely. So, why you won't get fined under GDPR? I'll talk a little bit about the Information Commissioner, what she says, or rather start with what her deputies say. I'm going to talk a little bit more about statistics and what I really mean by statistics, and then if I've got any time, I'll talk about why the Information Commissioner is wrong about why she thinks, or how she thinks, that GDPR will actually come to be enforced. So, starting off with fines. This is what the Deputy Information Commissioner, or one of the Deputy Information Commissioners said. The Information Commission Office is a very sort of structure like that. There's an Information Commissioner at the top, which is a she, by the way, from Canada. And underneath her, there's 11, 13, I can't remember the exact number, of deputies. So it's a very flat structure like that. So one of her deputies said, it's a widely held misconception that DPA is an onerous imposition of unnecessary and costly red tape. In my view, it is precisely that, but there again, who am I to say? I'm not a data protection commissioner. Incidentally, you might think that I think the Information Commission Officer is doing the wrong thing. I don't think she is at all. If I was the Information Commissioner, if I was a Deputy Information Commissioner, I would do exactly what she says. It's just that, so what, is my opinion. GDPR is no different to any other new legislation. This is a fascinating statement. GDPR is no different to legislation. How many people have actually looked at the GDPR? A little bit of it. Interesting. And I asked this question of lawyers a couple of weeks ago, and surprise, surprise, no lawyer knew the answer to this. Here's an interesting question for you. How many words are there in an average novel? 180,000. Sorry? 180,000. 180,000? You must be into Tolstoy, is all I can say. No, the average novel, in fact, lawyers do know the answer to this. The average novel is about 65, 75,000 words long, maybe 90,000 words long. How many words in the GDPR? This is the question nobody knew the answer to. You'd think if somebody was going to read it, they'd know how many words they're going to read. They put what the things for. How many words are in it? 92,500. 92,500. Actually, even that is a lie. The actual number of words in the GDPR are, in the English language version, 92,500 words. In Europe, which language version prevails? German? Had German here. Some very pro-German. Anybody apart from Germany, or is it Germany? You only got Germanites in the audience. France. Somebody say France. Thank you. We've got French here. France, Germany. Any other countries? No. Nobody likes Holland or anything. Nobody can tell me. Sorry.
English.
English, yeah, English. We're very English, so we think English rules the world. Well, I mean, Britannia ruled the waves. Does English rule the European Union? Have you know the answer to this question? Which language version prevails in Europe? The answer is none of them do. Each of them have equal status in the law. How many languages in Europe? It's not the same as the number of countries in Europe, of course, because some countries like the UK and Ireland share the same language, or for purposes of European law say the same language, like Austria and Germany both share German for the purposes of European Union legislation. How many? Sorry? 15 countries? The answer is the number of official languages in Europe is 23 and a half official languages. There are 23 and a half official languages in the European Union, and if you work that out, the maths is over 2 million words in the GDPR. Over 2 million words. And by the way, I have actually looked at the Italian and the French versions to try and disambiguate a point, by which I mean try and understand what it meant by a point. It didn't really help me because the French version took me one way and the Italian version took me another, so it didn't really help me. But there you go. Different language versions are not translated exactly the same. You'd think they should be, but they're not. GDPR is fundamentally different from legislation, if only because of the length. GDPR failure will damage your reputation. The Information Commissioner herself said this. If I've got time, I'll talk about damage to reputation. May or may not have time to go down that route. Major opportunity and competitive advantage. Yeah, there are actually some very interesting competitive advantages you can get out of GDPR, but for most people, most of the time, there aren't competitive advantages, but sometimes, if you're very clever, you can find some. Again, not going to talk about those, I haven't got time. GDPR is only a step change. Well, the Information Commissioner, Deputy Information Commissioner obviously has a different definition of a step change than I do, but 92,500 words is not a step change in my book. Also, this is different. A different officer in the ICO said that day one is day one, it'll be enforced. Yes, it'll be enforced, but I haven't seen anybody being fined yet. What a surprise. We'll come back to, well, we're going to look at the statistics next. So what precisely does the Information Commissioner do? Does she fine anybody at the moment? Well, the last statistics which are available are actually the ones that were published for last year, which of course deal with a period up to, in fact, 2016, up to essentially 2016, published last year. So in 2016, there were a total of how many people fined under the old legislation? The answer is 16 people were fined, a total of 1.6 million. That's £100,000 each. 16 people. Now, under the old legislation, you didn't have to tell the Information Commission Office if you were in breach of the legislation. Well, if you didn't have to tell the Information Commission Office you were in breach of the legislation, how did she ever find out that people were in breach to fine them in the first place? You might ask. It's a perfectly reasonable question. Well, the answer is twofold. Anybody know the answer? One of the answers to this, two answers to this. How did she know that people were doing things wrong so she could fine them in the first place if people didn't have to tell them they did anything wrong? Under the new legislation, that's a different talk, you're supposed to tell the Information Commission Office if you mess things up, if you have a security breach. So that's a different talk as to when you have to do that, when you don't have to do that. But basically, the starting point under the new law is every single breach. I repeat that. Every single breach has to be, in theory, reported to the ICO. That's not what will happen, but that's what the law says. So if in the past nobody had to report a breach, how comes she knew about the breaches at all to fine people? Anybody know?
Legal action.
Sorry?
Legal action.
Legal action? What, I mean acing? But no, that's a good idea though, but that's not how she picked up breaches. How did she know there were breaches in the past? Sorry?
Whistleblowers.
Whistleblowers, it's interesting thing about whistleblowers, I think whistleblowers will come into the new legislation, but I don't think whistleblowers applied in the old legislation. There were two ways. One is there was an exception, there has been an exception for telecoms company. And you know the big telecoms company that got fined? TalkTalk, thank you. So TalkTalk got fined. They actually got fined not just for the breach, but for not telling the Information Commission Office that they had a breach, because there's a different bit of legislation, not data protection legislation, which requires, since about 2012, if my memory serves me correctly, telecoms companies to report breaches. So that's been a separate regime. So she knew about TalkTalk because they were obliged to tell her. In fact, TalkTalk had 3 breaches. They were only fined for 1 of them. The other circumstance, there were actually 1,950 breaches that were reported in 2016, out of which 16 were fined. Most of those 1,950 were not, in fact, telecoms companies. They were, and I know there are at least 2 people here in the audience because I'm looking at them now and they told me who they were from. Which other sort of organisations voluntarily report breaches and have voluntarily reported breaches for a long time? No, not banks. Banks are the complete opposite. They'll go about a mile away from reporting a breach if they've got any sense.
Healthcare.
Sorry? Healthcare, yeah. What's healthcare an example of? Public sector, thank you. Why do public sector, correct, why do public sector bodies voluntarily report breaches?
Why?
Sorry?
Freedom of information.
I didn't hear, sorry, you have to shout up.
Freedom of information, someone find out that way.
Well, you could apply that to banks. Why do public sector bodies, as opposed to banks or anybody else, voluntarily report breaches?
Because nobody takes the blame there?
Because they...
Nobody takes the blame there?
Because maybe. It's a bit of that. It's a bit of that. It's not a bad shit. The answer is because, and it is a bit of what you say, it's because public sector bodies have no idea how to take a commercial risk. They don't understand a commercial risk, the concept of a commercial risk, and therefore not reporting the breach. Some people will tell you, well, actually, that's not very fair, Dai, because there's a possibility that in certain circumstances you could have what's called a freedom of access, a freedom of information request. In other words, you can make a demand from a public sector company to give you freedom of information. It could come out of that, but that's pretty unlikely. The reality is they don't know how to take commercial risk and therefore they don't do it. And as you say, TalkTalk was the largest fine, £400,000. Interestingly, I said there were 16 fines for breaches of data protection in the last statistics available. In that same period, there were 21 convictions, essentially for mostly failing to register or failing to respond to information notices. If the Data Protection Information Commission Office ask you for information, you don't reply, then that is a criminal offence, easier for them to prove, and also unlawfully obtaining data, that is people like private detectives or policemen wrongly giving usually information about who was driving a particular car at a particular time out of the DVLA database. Those were criminal offences, of which the Information Commissioner wasn't necessarily responsible for all those prosecutions, because that's not what she does mostly. So what about people, somebody mentioned whistleblowers, and whistleblowers, I guess, are an example of people voluntarily complaining to the Information Commission Office and saying, well, these people are not doing what they should be doing with respect to my data. In that same period, 2016, there were 18,000 complaints from people saying, this company has breached my data protection requirement. 18,000. 16 actions taken, 16 people fined. Very, very few, if any, were actioned on. She's looking at the breaches more than anything. She's not actually doing anything about complaints. And I already said to you, 1,950 were the number of self-reported breaches. So you work that out, that's an enforcement rate of 0.82%. So the probability in 2016, if you reported a breach, was that you were going to get the 0.82% chance that you were going to get fined. Convictions, I said there was greater, 1.9%. Interestingly, if you look at that and as you compare it, 21 convictions 16 data breach fines. Actually, most people that she enforced were people who did unsolicited communications, telecommunications marketing. These are people who phone you when they shouldn't be because you've asked them not to phone people, and people who phone people in the middle of the night, etc., to sell whatever they're trying to sell. And that's a different bit of legislation. That's not data protection, that's unsolicited communications. Unsolicited automated marketing. They were fined a total of 1.9 million, which is a lot more than people who were fined for data protection. She's involved in both. But let's have a look at risk. What is the business risk of breaching the GDPR? Because that's what I'm supposed to be talking about. Well, of course, if you're looking at a business, you're analysing a business risk, you have two elements. You have the harm to your business, and you have the probability of that harm actually occurring. Two aspects, the harm and the probability of the harm arising. Of course, you can also keep in mind that the average fine to date is £100,000. Of course, that's under the old legislation where the maximum was 5 million. And here's another lie. What do lawyers stand up and tell you your maximum fine is? What's the maximum fine of the GDPR? It's not 5 million anymore. 4%. Somebody say 4%? Rubbish. It is not 4%.
Whichever is greater.
Sorry?
20 million, I think.
20 million euros. Lots of lawyers, and if you look at the press, most of the press will tell you your maximum fine is 4% of your annual turnover. Why is that complete and utter nonsense? Well, the answer is quite simple. 99.99% of businesses in this country have a turnover. Everybody here got a turnover of less than £500 million? What, more than £500 million rather? What a surprise. Nobody here's got a turnover of more than £500 million. You've got to have a turnover of more than £500 million before you start worrying about 4%. Now, your maximum fine, in euros anyway, is 20 million euros, 70 million pounds, 17 million pounds. So for 99.9% of businesses, the maximum fine is not 4%, it's a lot more, by which I mean hundreds of percent of turnover of the average company. I don't know what the average company turnover is, but it's £500,000. You can get fined 20 times your turnover, is the maximum fine. So it's 20 million euros for 99.9% of businesses times what? That's the harm, or at least that's the maximum harm, a 20 million fine. Well, how many people will actually notify breaches? Well, there's two ways of looking at it, or more than one way anyway. One way is looking at how many does the ICO expect to get reported. In a couple of years' time, we'll know the actual number of breaches reported to the ICO. At the moment, I can only guess that. And also looking at the number of people who actually have breaches. So looking at the ICO, what did the ICO said? Well, one of her other deputies said, 30,000, I expect, he was actually the head of the GDPR Breach Notification Division, said, I expect 30,000 breaches to be notified. Okay, how many breaches will there actually be? Remember what I said before, in theory, every single breach should be notified. Or at least every single breach that leads to a potential harm of security harm. So let's add the fines and the convictions together. That's 37 actions. And let's suppose the resources double. When I prepared this slide, most people said to me, well, come on, Dai, she's going to have more resources, so let's double it to that's 74. She'll have twice as many resources. Actually, that's nonsense for two reasons. Reason number one is that it is actually conceptually difficult, harder, and I won't, basically because it's so much longer, which means there's extra rules, extra gubbins, extra defences for smart lawyers like me to find. There are, because you've got 92,500 words, it actually makes it harder for her to prosecute people, not easier. There's more loopholes, if you like, or more potential for loopholes. So she's got to build a more robust case in many respects under the new legislation than the old legislation. And interestingly, she has, in fact, recruited about half a dozen or possibly less criminal lawyers, ex-criminal lawyers, to help her build a case because she needs that expertise which she hasn't got at the moment. Actually, the other issue, of course, is I now know how many more people the data protection information, what budget she actually got. How many extra people did she get? Anybody know? She had 500 staff. and she got a budget from the UK government to allow her to recruit an extra 200. So she's now got 700. So again, it hasn't doubled, it's actually gone up. But actually, if you look at that statistic, it's about the same because, under the new GDPR, it makes it harder, not easier, for her to bring actions for a number of reasons that I won't bore you with. So, if you look at the GDPR, I look at the Information Commissioner's own statistics, and you take a worst case scenario, say 75 actions, not to make the maths easier, that gives you a 1 in 400 probability of action being taken against you by her own statistics. It's interesting, you know, I guess most of you are following this. Have you really got struck with the maths so far? Good. You've no idea how difficult it is to get lawyers to understand maths this simple. You really wouldn't believe it.
So all reports of a breach are a natural break of compliance. You're actually meeting compliance by notifying a breach. It's whether you're not taking your information security seriously. If you don't report it, then you're going to be in breach. But
yeah, so if you don't report it, you've got 2 breaches instead of 1. Breach number 1 because you had the security breach in the first place, and breach number 2 because you didn't report the breach you were supposed to report. Does that make any sense to you?
that would be, now you're getting towards a breach. But yeah, the data breach versus the breach.
No, the law requires you to report a data breach, which leads to personal data being leaked, not corporate data, personal data. And of course, if you don't do that, that means first of all you've had a breach which you haven't reported. So the breach itself is a wrong under the legislation, and then the non-reporting is a separate wrong. But let's not go down that route. Don't need to. By our own statistics, as I say, it's 1 in 400. Of course, 30,000 breaches, to me and probably to you, is nonsense. How many breaches are there actually going to be? So, by the way, if you work out 20 million by 400, that's still a lot of money. That's 50,000. That's 50,000 euros. What it does mean is you should be spending 50,000 euros on compliance, because if you are, then you're doing about what would happen if you didn't, i.e., the probability of being fined against what's about the harm. But let's look at the real. Let's look at the real number of breaches. A government survey last year, again 2016, published last year, said that 46% of companies are annually breached. That's the government's own statistics. I think it was University of Southampton. Of course, whether it's Portsmouth or Southampton was paid as one of the lead people to do this research. And this research is quite interesting because it doesn't just involve large companies. Lots of accountancy firms, the likes of KPMG, Pricewaterhouse, etc., they look at surveys primarily of banks and try and work out what sort of, they do breach surveys each year. But they don't look at small companies because KPMG and Pricewaterhouse don't sell to small companies, not interested in small companies. The interesting thing about this survey, it's not just looking at large corporates, it's looking at companies of all sizes. And again, let's be conservative, that was their figures, 46%, the government's own statistic. Interestingly, the first speaker, Darren, said, is he here? Is Darren still here? Thank you, Darren. You said there was you were just talking, of course, about ransomware. You said there was a ransomware attack every 40 seconds. Was that a UK-only statistics or worldwide? Sorry? Global. Okay, so that's interesting. So I worked that out with the help of my friend down here, as 380,000 thereabouts successful ransomware attacks a year. But that's, of course, not just the UK, that's the whole of the world. But that's just ransomware. 380,000 successful ransomware attacks global against companies worldwide. Then we're talking not just about ransomware, we're talking about any successful or any incident which causes you a security breach. So let's assume that notifiable breaches are half of those. In fact, in reality, most people will not notify most breaches that require to be notified. Most breaches, virtually every single breach in theory is notifiable, but that's a different story. How many companies are in the UK? Actually, a lot more than 3 million probably, but 3 million active companies, give or take. And half of them are being breached, according to the government's own report. 46% of companies have had a breach annually. But as I said, let's assume only half of those are notifiable breaches. That gives you 0.75 million companies that should be breaches that should be reported. And of course, the government statistic was, have you been breached at least once in the year? Not how many breaches have you had, it was, have you been breached at least once in the year? You work out the statistics on that, well, again, go back to the number of fines, and you get essentially 1 in 10,000. And that's a conservative figure. I actually think it's probably closer to 1 in 100,000 probability of being fined, not 1 in 10,000. Which means you should be spending about €2,000 on compliance to match the probability of risk versus harm. Does this all matter? What is the ICO actually trying to achieve? This is, I gave you before, I told you what the ICO's deputy said. Let's give you a different quote. Who said this? Predictions of massive fines under GDPR that simply scales up penalties issued under the Data Protection Act are nonsense. Anybody got a guess who said that? I'll put you out your misery. The person who said that was the ICO herself. She's not taking the same line as her deputies. She's saying it's nonsense. You're not all going to get fined. What the ICO is actually trying to achieve is quite simple. If you think about GDPR compliance, anybody who ever says to you they are GDPR compliant, even if they have spent $250,000, is talking absolute nonsense. And believe me, I've been on panels with people who do spend, have spent $250,000, very sensibly spent $250,000, they're not spent on the wrong thing, and I can debunk their compliance in 2 words. Now, mobile telephones. So I say to them, okay, you're a big hotel chain, a big mega hotel chain. I work with a lot of travel companies actually in GDPR. And you're a mega hotel company and you spent £250,000 being GDPR compliant. Brilliant. Okay, suppose you have a really interesting complaint that somebody's complained about, cockroaches in the bed, whatever it is. Are you really telling me that your managing director is not going to send a text message to the marketing director about what's going to happen in this case that's coming to the court next week about Mrs. Blogs and fleas in the bed, or whatever the case is about? Are you really telling me that's not going to happen? Of course it's going to happen. And where's that data going? And what control have you got about that data in the text? Of course, the answer is none, and there's GDPR compliance breaches all over the place. So anybody who tells you they're GDPR compliant really does not know what they're talking about. It's not possible to achieve GDPR compliance. But if you look at take a graph of the number of companies. It's a very simple graph. Again, I'll make these things simple for lawyers, you understand, not simple for you guys. And 1 is compliance, 0 is you're not compliant at all. That is, thank you, that is the reality of life, okay? Most companies will never have heard of GDPR in 10 years' time. The average, I said hotel industry, the average Brighton bed and breakfast in 10 years' time, you'll say GDPR to it, have no idea what you're talking about. The average Brighton bed and breakfast. Have you ever heard of bed and breakfast? No, I didn't think so. The reality is that the number of people who actually comply with it are few. And by the way, if you add to that graph the cost of compliance, it's something like this. You know, you have to spend a little bit to do a little, but then you have to spend more and more and more to do more and more, to be more and more compliant. What is the Information Commissioner actually trying to do? What would I do if I was the Information Commission Office with a limited budget as a civil service, quasi-civil service? The answer is all she's trying to do is shift that line a little bit to your right. She's just trying to make a little bit more people a little bit more compliant. And if she's doing that, she's doing a good job, don't get me wrong. But she's not going to go out and fine everybody. She hasn't got the resources to do it even if she wanted to. Say her statistics 1 in 400, my statistics 1 in 10,000 plus. It's not going to happen. It doesn't work that way. If you go back to what the Information Commission said, said that she said predictions of massive scale are nonsense. She went on to say, GDPR, this is her quote again, gives the ICO a suite of sanctions to help organisations comply with warnings, reprimands, corrective orders. While it's not hitting organisations in their pocket, their reputations will suffer a blow. Fascinating bit of more nonsense. Do companies actually lose money, lose reputation through data protection breaches?
Yes.
Fascinating question. Well, I can't say that all of the companies all of the time will not suffer. I can guarantee that, yes, there were a couple. How many people, honestly, here knew about TalkTalk? I mean, I know a couple of people put their hands up. Yeah. Okay, this is a cybersecurity audience. I would expect that. I guarantee if I'm actually a bunch of lawyers, none of them will know that it was TalkTalk that was the last telecommunications company that got done. Don't shout out the answer to this. How many people here can name me, if I ask them to, a bank that's been security breached? Put your hand up if you can name a bank that had a public security breach. What, just 2 people? 3 people? Come on. Must be more than that. You all need TalkTalk. Some of you need TalkTalk. Put your hand up if you know a name of a bank that's had a security breach. Okay? Keep your hand up if you can name 2 banks. 2 different banks which have had a public security breach. Am I the only person in the audience that can say this? Only people here. Come on. There must be more than just me. 3 banks? Do I have any takers for 3 banks? Can you name 3 different banks that have been publicly breached? Come on, we're talking about public reputation here, and you all said no, this is nonsense, Dai. People suffer reputations. Can you name 3 banks that have had public security breaches? Put your hand up if you can. Nobody here, you're supposed to be a cybersecurity professionals, nobody here can put their hand up and say they've named 3 banks. I don't believe you. The answer is, though, every single bank you can name to me, I can show you on that computer the record of the breach. Virtually every single bank has had a public security breach. And you talk to me about reputation? I don't believe it. I just do not believe it. Look at this slide. One of the largest, if not arguably the largest, breach in terms of monetary loss, because they were allegations they were going to get sued for $3 billion. In fact, they settled for a tenth of that, about $300 million in damages. Won't explain why, because it's an American company. Can anybody show me there where the breach was? That's their share price for the last 7 years, or 6 years, I guess. The drop was actually here. That was a drop. You can't even see it in the scale of things. Yes, it's a drop. Yes, it was about 1/3 of their value. But in reality, in the scale of things over the years, and yes, the CEO lost his job, the Chief Executive Officer, not just the CTO, not just the Chief Technology Officer, the CEO lost his job. But nevertheless, in terms of reputational damage, I just don't believe it. Thank you very much indeed, and I will be around for questions.